All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the VulnWise show, where we bring you exclusive interviews with cybersecurity experts and thought leaders to help you conquer the chaos of vulnerability management. Love saying that. I'm Steve Carter, the CEO and co-founder at Nucleus Security, and I'm joined by Scott Kuffer, our COO and a fellow co-founder. And we've got a great show for you today. Our guest is none other than Eli Woodward, and Eli is a cyber threat analyst with over a decade of cybersecurity experience, and he currently works for a large financial services company. That's about all I'll say about that. And we're excited to have Eli on the show today because threat and vulnerability intelligence continues to become more and more relevant to vulnerability and exposure management, to the point where I would argue you simply can't do a good job if you're not using intelligence for prioritization. And so, Eli, thank you so much for being here today and being willing to share your thoughts and wisdom with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I'd like to kind of start things off here by talking about some basics here around threat and vulnerability intelligence. Most people that I come across are knowledgeable either about traditional threat intelligence, so think IOCs, threat actors, campaigns, TTPs, things like that, or vulnerability intelligence. And that gets into exploits and exploit code and sysacav and prioritization methodologies and things like that. It's rare these days that I speak with someone like you who has really what from what I can tell, a lot of experience with both. So just to kind of level set here on technology, on terminology, how do you really differentiate between threat intelligence and vulnerability intelligence, if you differentiate, and then how are they related in your mind?
Yeah, so the definition of terms is kind of a big thing that I've done a lot of digging. I actually just finished my master's degree, and during that, I actually ended up going through a paper that at one point found like 23 different definitions for threat intelligence and what it is. So like from the academic space, don't look for any sort of like unified definition of what is threat intelligence. And, every vendor and thought leader on LinkedIn and Twitter and everywhere else, they all have their own like way of defining it. So, okay, here's my chance to take a stab at it. But yeah, basically the threat intel, from what I've come to understand it, is just basically what is the landscape of the ecosystem and the environment we're in. And that can incorporate a lot of different things, like what you were talking about. What's the infrastructure the bad guys are using? How are they using it? What are they targeting these days? Everything from like, what kind of threat actor are you looking at? Is it more e-crime based? Is it more like nation state, political or financial espionage kind of things? Like for a long time, 5-10 years ago, we saw the Chinese APT groups. They were real interested in going after large data sets and databases. So things like the Anthem hack, Equifax database, stuff like that. You fast forward to today and you've got, last weekend or 2 weekends ago, the Clop ransomware gang going after their 5th file transfer application 0-day campaign when they hit the Clio applications. So, it's just kind of really just understanding what it is you have and what your threat actors might be who might be interested in you, and, just kind of building out from there. I think vulnerability intelligence kind of calls it as a subset of that. Threat intel is kind of inherently reactive because you have to wait for the bad guys to act and then you kind of react to that. Vulnerability intelligence, I think, tends to be a little more proactive in that you are reading that landscape, but you're also taking proactive actions based on all of that. And, we're immediately patching. We have mitigations in place. We're, hardening infrastructure, things like that. So that's kind of just how I've kind of come to view it all. But, I'm sure if you ask 3 CTI people for their opinion on that, you'll get 5 answers.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think about it very similarly, I would say. I think that like historically and traditionally, I guess it was more SOC teams and security analysts that were using threat intel and using it to monitor and hunt for active threats, things like that. And then, we've seen vulnerability intelligence be used more and more, but to your point, it's more for proactive reasons, right? It's more, we see a lot of IT security teams now and network security teams now using vulnerability intelligence for prioritization, right? That's one of the big use cases, but that's very much, very much a proactive use case versus the kind of more of the reactive stuff on the ops side. But yeah, I mean, to an extent, I kind of see them coming together as well. And we're starting to see a lot more SOC teams very much more up to speed on vulnerability intelligence than they were 5 years ago. And to your point, making those associations, right? The associations between campaigns and the exploitation of specific vulnerabilities, and then even sharing that information internally with teams. So come a long way in that regard, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's not just the SOC necessarily. Like I find I'm communicating a lot with our networking teams. So like there was a rash of vulnerabilities involving the F5 management interface. Same thing. I think Juniper had some other big ones recently with their UI or management interface being targeted. And so there's kind of a theme here of like, hey guys, we don't have any management interfaces externally facing, right? No, we follow best practices, things like that. You check on Shodan. There's a lot of folks who still need to learn that lesson, and unfortunately might learn it the hard way. But yeah, that's one of those things where it's going beyond just your traditional SOC to now building out into, our network configuration and, just, architecture as well, and kind of informing that in a smart way to say, hey, we see this trend in vulnerabilities that are getting exploited right now. Are we staying ahead of that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, Eli. And first of all, thanks for joining us again today.
Yeah,
one thing that comes to mind right now is as you're speaking, and I totally agree with a lot of what you're saying, but one thing that really comes up a lot for me is around the outcome and the ownership almost dictating the differences, right? Like when I think about who's the data for, in a lot of ways, it kind of seems like it's really a lot of just the same information. You're just happening to look at it from a different angle, and the order in which you're kind of consuming it actually drives a lot of the differences between them. Like, so when I think about traditional threat intel, I think about like IOCs and threat actors and like what's happening. But then when I think about how you use vulnerability intelligence, it's a lot of the same data, but you start with what vulnerabilities do we have, or what vulnerabilities do we care about? Then we look at the threat actors. Then we look at the exploitation that's happening, then the threat actors. So we kind of go at it from a different angle. And it's really like the same type of information, but it feels like it's how you use it. And from that perspective, I haven't seen or I haven't had a lot of experience with the tips themselves actually being really good at that other angle, the vulnerability intelligence angle. It's like, it seems like a lot of the data is there. It's just not really accessible in a way that's usable. How do you feel about that? Is that something that you see as well?
Sorry, I'm not clear on what the question is exactly there.
So like when I think about like a recorded future, for example, like to call out, not going to call out vendors necessarily, but like if I want to go and look in their platform, right? Mm-hmm. I would say, okay, here's all your threat actors that are doing things. And then you have to click into the threat actor. Then you look at what they're exploiting. Then you look at the vulnerabilities associated with that threat actor. But it's very hard to pivot off and say, okay, well, here's the one vulnerability, and then here's all the threat actors. Here's all the exploitation happening for this one object. It's like buried within the console. And so my point was more, the data seems the same, but it seems like they're built not necessarily to service the vulnerability management teams, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so as far as, your threat intel vendors handing out info like that, it's very diverse across the landscape, right? What I've been finding more and more is it's interesting to see some of these other companies that are coming out with, doing their own kind of like vulnerability notifications and heads up. So like Feedly, they've actually started to transition from a news aggregator into suddenly like they're doing, from what I've seen, a fairly decent job of being able to aggregate CVE intel. I don't know if you've seen their pages and whatnot, but it actually, like when I first saw it, I was like, man, this just did a really good job of answering all the questions I would have answered. And I just realized, like, if they automate this, I'm out of a job. Like, holy smokes. But, they do a pretty good job of that, the bottom line up front stuff, hitting that real fast and real quick. I found another one recently, intel.intruder.io. So they, again, similar. I don't know if you guys have looked at that at all, but they've actually got like a cool little hype meter that, kind of gives you what are the top. And same thing with like the Feedly CVE main page. They can kind of give you an idea, like what are the CVEs people are talking about right now. It's kind of like the hallmarks of like the CVEtrends.com. Some guy built a couple of years ago. It was based on like what were the most talked about CVEs on Twitter in the last 24 hours. And so, yeah, I found those to be pretty handy just as far as getting, rapid intel about, new CVEs coming out, and in some cases I've seen it be better than like some of the paid offerings some of those threat intel vendors are providing these days.
Right. Yeah, they're definitely like coming up and for, just starting to support some of those use cases. I think, traditionally, like they haven't done a great job, but I think that they've realized how important at least some of the vulnerability intelligence stuff is to, especially to larger enterprises that are trying to prioritize things in more of a custom way, right? I think there's still a lot of organizations that are just taking CVSS base scores and doing their thing with it, and that's it. But a lot of other organizations, even smaller organizations we're seeing now, have pretty sophisticated prioritization methodologies where they're using all this intel. And so I think that the market's starting to try to catch up with that. But, on this prioritization, well, actually, I guess it's not really so much related to prioritization, but there was, I want to switch gears a little bit. There's an article that you wrote, I think it was maybe earlier this year, that was talking about, the differences in what the Palos of the world, CrowdStrike, Mandiant, and I believe it was Verizon were all reporting on vulnerability exploitation, and particularly as it relates to breaches and being, to what degree is it the root cause or the initial attack vector in a breach? And what you were writing about was kind of the discrepancy across those reports, especially between, I believe it was the DBIR and most of the other reports, where the other reports were kind of saying that, hey, vulnerability exploitation, it's the number one, maybe number one or number two initial attack vector in the breaches and compromises that these vendors are studying, where the DBIR, I think it had it down there in the list as a much smaller percentage. And so you pointed that out in the article, which I thought was interesting. But I was wondering if you have any theory as to why those discrepancies exist. What do you really think the ground truth is as to, is vulnerability exploitation really the number one thing that folks should be concerned about in terms of, a breach or a compromise?
I mean, oh boy, that gets me off on a rant now. So there's actually a paper that came out about a year and a half ago now. Trying to remember the conference, but a couple of academics and lawyers got together, and it's called, I'm trying to remember the name of the paper now. But basically what they identified is, it's called Lessons Lost. And it's basically that we've created this insurance industry now where you have an incident, you call in insurance, they do work under privilege, under a lawyer. It's then it's under lock and key under an NDA. And as a result, the industry isn't getting to learn these wider lessons. And so what you're getting is these compartmentalized silos of these individual firms that are going out and doing all of this incident response stuff. And they're turning out great data. Unfortunately, it's all biased by what it is they see, what is their pipeline of work. So I think, a Mandiant and a CrowdStrike, they're going to have very sophisticated clients. They're going to have organizations that, probably a lot more mature security programs if you can afford to call in like a Mandiant or somebody like that, right? And if your insurance is paying for that, I imagine to afford that insurance, you probably, had to have a pretty robust security program. In order for someone to actually get into you, it's not going to be with just a simple phishing page because you don't have MFA turned on, I imagine. They're going to have to use a little more sophisticated means. And so as a result of that basically a selection, self-selecting bias, we ended up seeing that those larger, more complicated, mature firms, they end up leaning more heavily towards 0 days where the initial access vectors, just because that's who their clients were. And last year, 2023, we had MoveIt. There was a couple of other big ones that came out. So I think that also probably really lended heavily to it. The Clop Gang alone in last year, they did MoveIt, they did the Go Anywhere MFT, they did Papercut NG, and they did the SysAid one at the end of the year. Microsoft actually added that one under Lace Tempest. That's what they call them. But that's kind of what I've seen be the result of these different firms and their reporting. Is basically what I suspect is really, you can boil it all down to the ground truth is it's because of the NDAs, and these researchers and academics, they did a really good job of highlighting this issue. I put together a talk I wanted to give, but I didn't end up getting the chance to, called Ransomware Threat Actor of the Year, the Lawyers, because they keep things so secretive. we as a wider industry, we're kind of prevented from learning these lessons of, okay, what is the truth of across all of these things? Well, there's no safe place for them to all share information. There's no, we've got things like CISA and KEV and things like that, but there's no real mechanism, and there's certainly not any mandatory reporting for these organizations, whether they're insurance, whether they're IR firms, to report in all this data. So the best we're left with is we have to look at a bunch of different IR firms and what they're providing us. And I'm not complaining. Like, I'm not pleased if you're like at one of those firms. Don't interpret this as just stop reporting. No, it's fantastic data. But I think leaning on that as the source of truth, and clearly this is, the most important thing we need to worry about. Well, if you don't have MFA turned on, like, you've got bigger things to worry about than, if you've got, the 4-year-old vulnerabilities patched internally. Like, let's work on the basics first, right? So context is key too.
Yeah, so I actually have a couple questions about that. Obviously your soapbox here is going to start another soapbox. All the soapboxes. But, obviously one of the patterns that I noticed from reading your article was that it seems to me that what they saw, a lot of it had to do with visibility, right? So it's like Mandiant, of course, was looking at the incidents that they worked, and then you had CrowdStrike working their incidents. And I just thought it was funny that, of course, CrowdStrike is going to see that, hey, where you can't install EDR or where it's difficult to install EDR is where all the exploitation happens, right? So there's some really interesting just patterns there when you look at the data, which I think you called out really well, which was interesting. But one question I had for you is, obviously you work in the the financial space. One thing that we're seeing somewhat, or that I've seen, is these like industry organizations where they do have a tendency to share some information, right? And I think in the old days, right? I use old days, but like I remember, like Steve, you remember this, like 2015, there was that DHS program that was like a threat intelligence Styx taxi server thing.
Oh yeah, Styx taxi.
I forget what it's called now, but what I am seeing is that, like the big, credit card processors might talk to each other about what they're seeing. Are you seeing that at all? Is it like, how fundamentally siloed are we? Is it across industry, or is it just in general?
Yeah, so there's certainly trust groups like FS-ISAC and, all the ISACs within the specific industries and whatnot. I haven't seen a lot of specifics come out of those places about, especially when it comes down to initial access. And I think that's something too to key in on here is a lot of what we're talking about is like, what is the source of the initial access? Because once the bad guys get in, they pretty much all do the same thing. They're going to establish persistence. They're going to elevate privileges. They're going to pivot around the network. They're going to do all those typical things. The big question is, well, if we can just keep them from getting in the first place, we're usually pretty good, right? So, what is that source of initial access? And yeah, I haven't seen anywhere that's too interested in sharing, here's how initial access occurred. That's usually, something you got to wait to see in the year-end reports.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the whole lessons lost thing is fascinating. I didn't realize that that's kind of where we are with, it makes sense. I guess I never really thought about it. But yeah, the DBIR in particular, I want to say that there's something like, maybe it was 10,000 breaches or whatever that they looked at, to pull out those insights and metrics. And I know that to your point, right, the CrowdStrikes and Mandiants of the world, it's a much smaller data set. It's probably, I don't think they say how many breaches they're looking at, but to your point, it's more sophisticated, probably much larger enterprises, probably a much smaller set. And so, that's what I've always speculated is the primary reason, right? It's just, hey, Mandiant has their data from their IR services and their MSSP business for that matter. And so they've got insight into those customers, and that's just a different set of customers, much more broad set of customers that Verizon's looking at, I think. But yeah, makes sense.
So who's right? That's the question.
Maybe they're both right. Yeah, who knows?
Very helpful.
But on the prioritization topic, though, before we move too far off from that, I know prioritization is still something that a lot of organizations, vulnerability prioritization, is still something that a lot of organizations struggle with. And I think I mentioned earlier, right, we're starting to see a lot of organizations now, mostly larger organizations, but even some mid-sized and smaller ones, start to deploy, very customized prioritization schemes and methodologies and risk scoring and things like that to help them triage vulnerabilities, right? And one of the things I noticed in one of your projects, you mentioned that you had a project where you, and I'm going to quote your words exactly, where you evaluate and classify new CVEs and vulnerabilities for impact. So I'm going to assume from your laugh earlier in this call that you did more than just look at the CVSS base score. So can you tell us about that project and your approach to evaluating and classifying CVEs?
Yeah, so in my current role, like I said, I'm kind of more focused on, what are the new vulnerabilities that are coming out and what are the impacts of those, as well as just what's the overall, trend and chatter. And I've come to, from there, basically, I started a project internally of gathering POCs once they come out, proof of concept or exploit code once it comes out. And I'll go back through my logs and I'll see how long does it take after it gets posted to GitHub or Twitter before I actually see it in the logs. And right now it's generally trending about an hour, sometimes a little less. Sometimes it's been like, I think the fastest one I saw was 9 minutes from when it was on Twitter. And so it's this kind of numbers that if you had told me that like a year or two ago, I would have said, no way. But, having done this for as long as I have, I've got the data, I've got the logs, like I got the PowerPoint I showed to my management, like, man, this is how fast this is happening, right? And we've been able to turn around and correlate that directly to the more chatter stuff is getting, the faster we're seeing it weaponized and come at us and whatnot. So really like paying attention to, what are you seeing on the social media feeds right now? What are you seeing in those like hype meters and things like that? That does matter, unfortunately, right, wrong, or indifferent. I kind of joke sometimes I'm a professional doom scroller now. I just spend all day looking on Twitter for like, what's the worst vulnerability now? But, there is a direct correlation to how popular that stuff is to how fast it gets picked up and weaponized, et cetera. We certainly saw that last year with Move It. There was like the initial exploitation by Klopp, but then in very short order, there was like 3 or 4 additional critical vulnerabilities that came out because the whole community said, oh, this is cool. How many other, SQL injections can we get in here? Arbitrary file uploads. And it turns out there's quite a bit, like probably 3 or 4 in short order. Same thing happened with Avanti earlier this year. Vulnexity publishes their thing, what was it, like January 6th, January 7th, and within 6 weeks, they had like 3 or 4 more critical vulnerabilities back to back, all around the same product. So I think what we've definitely noticed is, paying attention to, like I said before, like just that global context and, environment, and using that to kind of, ascertain how much of a risk is this right now. And of course, you also have to look at the context too of, is this something that's internet facing? Is this something that has mitigating controls? Is it something that's behind a VPN login? Is it something internal only? All those other factors too, that might or might not be more interesting. So, is it something that I need a user to connect to a vulnerable domain controller and I need them to, first click on this Microsoft Word document and I also need to exfil, the NTLM hash, all this other stuff. It's like, okay, that's maybe not, my threat actors that I'm worried about right now. Probably, not leveraging that kind of stuff. And that's kind of sorry, I'll stop there. That just to answer your question up front. But from there, we can kind of dive into, how much the industry focuses on APTs and how spooky they are versus run-of-the-mill crime groups that are also something you need to think about.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, from everything you just described there, it sounds like you've got a sophisticated approach, right? I like the approach of, to your point, monitoring social media and chatter and that correlation between that and exploit development, things like that. But it sounds almost like more of a kind of an art than a science, right? It sounds like you don't have necessarily, numbers assigned to the chatter and things like that, where you're like taking all these numbers, mashing it together and saying, okay, based on these facts, we're going to rate this a 100, out of a 1 to 100 or a critical or something like that. Do you have any kind of methodology like that, or is it just kind of more, monitoring and doing the research and responding?
Definitely the latter. It's fairly, like I said, art more than science at this point. And two, there's always that X factor of, because going back to like the CVSS score, that's certainly a part of it. but do the vendors always tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in the CVSS score? There was one in particular where they said it's just a denial of service. It'll just cause the device to reboot. Now, during the reboot, it also inserts, remote code. They can arbitrarily run code, but it's just a denial of service. And we're like, wait, read that again? Slower? Like, did you just say during the reboot it can also like insert like arbitrary code? That doesn't sound like just a denial of service. That sounds a lot worse than a 7.9. Like,
right. Well, yeah, there's not an incentive there to necessarily score correctly on everything, is there?
Well,
right, yeah.
Crazy. I was literally just talking to some friends earlier today about, the differences between different CNAs and how they rate vulnerabilities, right? Because a lot of this is opt-in anyway, right? And so it's I'm reporting a CVE to some governing body, and so I basically have the responsibility to tell the truth about what it is or understand it. And a lot of times you have, these bigger companies are the ones that are, the CNAs that are submitting CVEs, and, they might not have the full context of what it actually means across all different product lines and whatnot, right? I think about especially the Microsoft ones, right? Where it's like, there's a lot of stuff going on in operating systems that are running Azure services, right? And so how do you think about a vulnerability in, Windows 10 service pack, whatever, when that might be what you're running in your Azure environments, right? So it gets really tricky pretty quickly when you just start thinking about CVEs and CVSS.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's where that context I think is super key.
All right. Well, I know we're coming up on time here. There's a couple things I definitely want to hit on before we wrap up, though. One is I saw that you've got you talked about having hands-on experience implementing AI tools. We have to talk about AI, right? But implementing AI for security operations. And I forget where I saw that, probably on LinkedIn. But you mentioned that you use AI for threat intel reporting and for automation specifically. So I guess the question is really where have you seen AI really have the most tangible impact so far in your work? And then I guess the follow-on to that is where are you most optimistic, I guess, that it will have an impact, let's say in 2025, right, in the near future?
Yeah. So definitely when there's like, again, these new big CVEs or just really any CVE coming out, being able to, and I've used some tools and we've got some vendors that basically are ingesting this stuff into their little LLM, and it's able to real quickly pop out and answer all the questions that, I need answered real quick. Is this exploited in the wild? Is there public exploit code? Things like that. And, another thing is just being able to take some of these gargantuan reports, like I think it was Mandiant earlier this year published a report that I needed info on quick, but, it pulls up and it says 15-minute read. Man, I don't have 15 minutes. I've got a P3 bridge standing up right now, and I've got 2 VPs joining. I need an answer in about 30 seconds, right? So being able to just throw that whole article in there and being able to boil it down real quick to how is this exploited? What are the IOCs I need? Is there a particular get or post request I need to start looking at my logs for? Things like that. Who is the target industry? Who's the threat actor? That can be kind of hard to initially scroll through and find, but, just being able to leverage that to just help dial in things real quick. And of course, we don't always 100% trust AI. So you go through, you validate and you trust, but verify that, okay, yeah, sure enough, this is the context is accurate here. But yeah, I've seen that have huge promise just to like make things, just happen so much quicker, so much faster.
Yeah, I found the exact same thing, and being able to quickly, especially in the context of vulnerability intelligence, particularly, being able to make those correlations between vulnerabilities and threat actors and campaigns and ransomware and things like that, so much easier with AI and LLMs than it was before, right? I feel like it was a nightmare to suss all that stuff out, but that's been a huge one. As far as like the future, is there anything you see coming up that you think it's going to help with in a major way, I guess? Yeah,
so I'm in some CTI groups, and we were talking about this last week, and one guy's got a little project he's working on where he's kind of ingesting all these reports, and he's showing how you can kind of like commoditize CTI and threat intel and vulnerability intelligence. And I think we're coming to an interesting point of mass customization, where maybe if you're an MDR or MSP company, previously you needed like maybe one CTI analyst to cover maybe a half dozen or a dozen clients, be able to, like, if they were wanting like more manually curated reporting and things like that. I think this is going to be a huge like force multiplier, in that one CTI analyst can now be used to generate reports for like 30 clients. And it's just this amazing ability to do mass customization. I was at a little pioneer town we have here in Phoenix last weekend, actually, and they had a Singer sewing machine there. And it was describing how Singer sewing machines were about $100 a piece because of how hard they were to build. But the guy who owned it at the time ended up working with some other industrialists in the 1890s. They figured out how to like mass produce these things for cheap, and suddenly it became available to everyone. And what I see is something similar happening with vulnerability and threat intel in the near future, where this right now is kind of, due to the price point, something more sophisticated orgs can afford to have, right? But if we can commoditize that at a much lower price point, this is something we can democratize and push out to a much wider audience at a much more affordable price point.
Yep, love it. Totally agree. Scott, what do you think? What do you think is coming?
With AI? Oh man,
yeah.
Tons and tons of opinions on that. But what's really fascinating to me is, I mean, obviously AI is really great at things like data transfer, data transformation, right? And so how do we connect, data over here that looks one way, turn it into something and then make it actionable or usable over there in another system. And so when I think about the pivoting that's required across different types of workflows, it's the ability to transform the information that's coming in from one spot, combining it with other information, and then being able to take those insights and then, distill it down. So I think about a world where, Eli, you mentioned, hey, you're in a meeting with your manager. Like I imagine a world where it's like you might not even have to be at that meeting because you have some little AI agent thing that's able to accurately describe what you want it to describe to your manager, but like using the information that it's looking at, right? And maybe it might not be quite that easy where it's just hey, you don't have to be there anymore. But to your point, it's about scaling the what you're able to do in your day-to-day life. I even think about there's this one company, this startup company that was trying to like get feedback from me not too long ago, where their whole thing was taking data out of a SIM and effectively saying, oh, well, we have to look up stuff in VirusTotal, we have to go look up stuff over here, and we just have to populate information from these services back into the system. And you absolutely could eliminate a huge amount of manual tasking and work through, just, hey, this is what needs to happen. Here's our process. And we can just make it happen. Right. So I think we're not too far off from that.
Yeah. It's funny just to see how far it's come in the last 2 years since ChatGPT got posted and everyone started playing with it. So it's interesting to see how far it's come in 2 years. And it's like, this has potential. I like it. Not quite there yet, but soon.
What I heard you say, Scott, is that we're all going to need to start looking for jobs in the next year. So.
No, we can start painting, creating images with the AI art machine on what a vulnerability, little thumbnail for our vulnerabilities are.
That's what we are. That's okay. Yeah.
VulnArt.
That's great. Yeah. No. I mean, when I think about at least 2025, it's less about vulnerability intelligence and how I think it's going to change that. But I think on the vulnerability management side of the house, there's some really interesting things that we'll start to see. Scott and I talk about this a lot, right? But I think when we get into root cause analysis and looking for patterns in your vulnerability data to figure out, hey, what specific technologies are responsible for the majority of my vulnerabilities, or what specific configurations or misconfigurations, or potentially even what specific teams or people are just doing a poor job at, writing code or writing insecure code, right? But doing that type of analysis at that level, I think is a great job. It could be really impactful for vulnerability management purposes anyway.
It's a fascinating thing, right? Because I know, Steve, you and I have been talking about the coding boot camp software, right? There's the software around secure coding training, and a big part of their whole analysis in their program is to figure out who needs training and why. And so being able to get more insight but from your real data instead of just from guessing, there's a lot of opportunities there on how you connect a lot of these different pieces of your security system that I think are really, really fascinating.
Absolutely.
That's cool.
Right.
Oh, we got a hum from Eli. That's a win. That's a win in my book.
Yes, that's a win. All right. Well, before we go here, Eli, I saw that you were at the NIHC at Bletchley recently, and I spent a lot of time in my career supporting three-letter agencies. Never made it out there, so I'm of course super jealous. But I went looking for any kind of deck or YouTube talk or anything like that from that event. Completely struck out. I couldn't find anything online about it. So can you tell us about the talk you gave and tell us about what Bletchley was like?
Yeah, so I finished up my master's in intelligence studies earlier this year, and I joined the North American Intelligence History Society. They put out a CFP, a call for papers, earlier this year for the first ever National Intelligence History Conference in Britain at Bletchley Park. So I was like, I've got a cool paper. We'll throw it in there. What the heck? Worst they can tell me is no. Well, no, it turns out the worst thing they could say is yes, because then the wife and kids were like, you're not going by yourself. So, like, all of us went, and, so that was pretty cool. Like, we're like, we got to get passports. Like, we're doing this. It's real, right? So anyway, no, it was a strictly offline conference. No photos, no videos, things like that, just because of who was in attendance. Pretty fascinating things. It was actually, like I said, intelligence history conference. And I was just blown away by like the incredibly niche topics that, people in the room were like all fairly familiar with that I thought was just completely obscure. Like, who had the more secure cryptographic algorithms in 1940? Was it the U.S. Army or U.S. Navy? And I saw a talk by Sir Dermot Turing, Alan Turing's nephew. And, he was kind of giving some fascinating insights into basically Bletchley Park was able to break the U.S. Army's crypto at the beginning of World War II. And, I don't know if you guys have done any kind of vulnerability research, but companies, when you sometimes come to them saying, hey, your product's insecure, you get to talk to their lawyers immediately, and they, again, shut you down pretty quick. They don't exactly want to hear about it. Go back 85 years in history, nothing's changed. When the U.S. Army was informed of their weak crypto, their first response was, well, clearly it's because you don't like the general assigned to Britain right now, so you're just trying to kick him out, and that's what this is all about. And they're like, well, no, here's actually what's going on. But yeah, it was just incredibly fascinating to get to hang out with some really smart people, and you dive into these really niche, obscure things in intelligence history. And again, at Bletchley Park, I've seen Imitation Game. You read all these things about how dark World War II was for Britain in 1939, 1940. I just never appreciated how truly terrified they were. And it was like, when they say dark times, they mean like we're grabbing all the kids, we're sending them to the country, we're grabbing all of our smartest brains, we're putting them in the same room, we're going to go break codes. Like it was, I just kind of became more real to me how terrifying that time in history was. So to be at the conference all afternoon and then to be at dinner and see Sky News up there with Putin talking about their readjusting their nuclear response positioning. And, it's like, man, it's been 85 years, but how much has really changed? Are we back in those dark days? So it was just kind of interesting to be balancing those historical moments with, modern context as well.
Yeah. No, it sounds amazing. Scott and I were just talking to someone that just finished rewatching the Band of Brothers series, and
that's right,
World War II. But no, that sounds fascinating. Is that a conference that's just open to the public? Anyone can go, or is it kind of like an invite only, or you have to present type thing?
No, yeah, as far as I could tell, yeah, anybody could sign up and go. So yeah, they're going to try to do it again next year. I got the chance to talk with the organizers a little bit, but yeah, they said, let's give it a try. This was their first time doing it, and yeah, they had a really good turnout. Their facilities aren't huge for conferences, so they might have already hit the max number. So if you see the conference come open again soon and you're interested, buy tickets fast, because I got a feeling they're going to sell out. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say Bletchley, like the facilities, like it's not huge, right? Like it's not a massive space. So that's very cool. I'll have to keep an eye out for it. I didn't even know. I never heard of it until I saw you talk about it. So it's something I'll have to put in the calendar to keep an eye out for.
Definitely, yeah. No, and being from Arizona, I appreciated the break from the heat. It was like 38 degrees was the high one day, so I was like, all right, this is a little different.
Yeah, no, very cool. Awesome. Well, guys, it's been a lot of fun. just about out of time here, but I do to wrap up. I do want to ask Eli if you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to leave with us as we wrap up here.
Patch your stuff, man. Yeah, basically you recognize that your vulnerability footprint. Nobody has 100% picture on that, but at the very least, you need to get a good picture of what's going on in your perimeter. Know what's internet facing. You absolutely have to have that, and don't be afraid to go making partners throughout the organization. I've seen some CTI folks be a little bit one of the blessings and the curses of our industry is we've got really smart folks. Unfortunately, sometimes they think they're so smart they have all the answers. Don't be that guy. That the one thing I've seen about the internet from the 30 years I've been on it is that it will make you humble quick if you get too arrogant. So stay humble, stay learning, and keep your ear to the ground about what's happening out there.
All right. So you heard it from Eli. Patch your stuff and be an extrovert. That's what I heard. So
I also heard the most interesting man in the world. The stay humble, my friends.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And that's it for today's episode of VulnWise. Big thank you to Eli for joining us today. And thank you all for tuning in. Take care, everybody.